Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special legal compliance session run by Kaizen Synergy Law Firm. My name is Nihal Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's COVIDSafe legal compliance webinar. Today's session focuses on the events and group classes as the roadmap around the countries allow agencies to reopen. We are going to focus on building on our session from last week, but also look specifically at how agencies are managing all of the relevant compliance data sets that they need to have in place to run group classes for their clients and how they are in fact doing this. There are many requirements that we need to look at as services reopen. These can include things like vaccination requirements, screening clients for whether they are vaccinated or unvaccinated, and what this means from a privacy point of view as well too, policy documents that your agency needs to have in place. So as things reopen, there are specific compliance obligations that your agency really needs to carefully consider and have in place to make sure that you meet all your work health and safety obligations. And we're going to cover these off really simply today to show you, and by showing you what other agencies exactly like yours are in fact doing and how they've managed to make their process for opening up a lot less stressful and ensure that they meet all their compliance obligations and keeping their staff and clients safe. As always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar and recorded, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So we are building off last week's session. We are just covering off the A to Z checklist and the legal requirements. I will be covering off also questions that people asked after the webinar last week and leading into next week's session as well too, around registers and roadmaps that you need to carefully consider as things reopen. So let's go through. As we recommended last week, it is important that you consider having your screening register for clients. We'll show you how agencies are doing this, looking at staff vaccination registers. There is talk now of booster shots and when these will come up and how do you manage those for your agency staff. Looking at things like client assessment policies, service agreements that your agency should be having in place, and also specific intake procedures for your client groups as well. So these are some of the key things that we looked at last week. We will be just revisiting these shortly and then jumping into how agencies are actually managing these. So when we look at group events and group classes, really we're focusing on community-based events that agencies have, group classes for agencies, and this may include also transport as well too, and moving people between your sites, and also client visits being conducted on residential sites, for example, in clients' homes as well. So there is a lot of information out there, as we've seen, and with it, there's everything from how to manage work risks and codes of practice to mobile apps that the Commonwealth Government issued last year and is being pushed again this year. We're seeing also different legislation coming up in Victoria. There's a massive public debate about new pandemic laws. So there is a lot of information out there. But for agencies like yourselves, you're really focused on, well, what do we need to do in order to meet our general compliance obligations in order to continue to open up our services? And is it business as usual, or what parts of this do we actually just need to ensure that we have in place to protect our staff, but also clients that may come in that potentially are unvaccinated? And do we or can we turn clients away if they are unvaccinated? And we'll come to that shortly as well. So as we move towards an increased vaccination population, we are still seeing that there is what I'll say is even if we are moving to an 80% vaccinated population or the likes, we are still seeing that potentially there is 20% of the population in Australia that are not vaccinated. Obviously, as people come and borders reopen as well too, obviously risks to exposures and the likes may increase as well. So there are different types of clients that you have, and we discussed this last week. There will be those that are fully vaccinated that have had their 2 jabs. There may be some that are partially vaccinated, some that may be exempt, or some that are not vaccinated as well too, as they are a vulnerable population group. And with the events, we came up and we discussed this last week around the specific pathways that you should be considering. And we sent out these slides last week. So essentially looking at what your roadmap allows you to do at any point in time, whether there are specific public health directives that you need to consider, and also what does that mean for yourself in terms of can you have different events that you may run, but what does this mean, as many of you raised during the session, about screening clients, whether you have consent to ask them the question whether they are vaccinated or unvaccinated, what if they have symptoms around this, how can you actually track it, and what is your work health and safety obligations to actually screening clients as well. So we went through some of the registration forms in terms of inviting attendees. You might have a registration form that you fill in, and also sign in an attendance register as well, to ensure whether, or ask the questions, whether people are either vaccinated or unvaccinated, and how do you in fact manage this process. So we started to look at last week. I'm throwing timelines all over the place at the moment. How as we looked at last week, we looked at the QR code type of style, and also hard copy register that you might have for people that are coming in to your agency to attend a group session. And they might use the QR code to actually check in using their phone. For those that don't have a mobile device, you can use an attendance register. And the attendance register that I'm showing you above is actually used by an agency called Creation Ministries International. And with it, they are in fact using it to keep people registered, keep a register of attendance when people are visiting client homes or pastoral leaders' homes as part of internal congregations. QR codes are also being used as part of a screening tool to allow people to actually view what they need to do and check in and review their specific symptoms as well too. So essentially what we are seeing is really a process to actually screen clients in as part of a safety measure for your agency. So generally when people are coming into your agency, and we're going to unpack this some more next week as well too, that generally people will be coming in that are either fully vaccinated, partially vaccinated, exempt, not vaccinated, or you may have somebody that is screened to be COVID positive. And what happens when this happens? Well, we're going to look at that now. Also, you may have, as part of these group classes, again, the same sort of process being followed, but what we are seeing essentially are the requirements to actually screen people in terms of the services. And the reason that we're looking to screen people that are coming in is to meet your work health and safety obligations. And I can see that we've just got a message from George, which I will jump to now as well too, just asking, are these the same rules for a non-for-profit organisation which falls under a religious organisation, as there is a blanket rule that religious organisations have an exemption for non-vaccinated? They do not require to ask staff if vaccinated or not. That's a good question, George. With the religious groups that we've actually advised around this, Part of that is you may have exemptions equally from a religious group itself, but this actually, the webinar that we're running does apply to not-for-profit agencies as a group, and that's where we are focusing on the community services sector. When we're looking at registrars for people and screening people for whether their vaccination status or the likes, what we're really looking at here, George, is, and it's a really good question, is to look at meeting your work health and safety obligations. Because as part of that, there is a positive obligation on employers to make sure that their workplace is safe from COVID, or they take all the mitigation strategies that they can, reasonable mitigation strategies to minimize COVID in the workplace. So if there is potentially a vulnerable population group that agencies, especially the not-for-profit and community service organizations, support, then essentially what you're looking at here is how can you ensure that you meet your work health and safety obligations? And it's a good question, George. I'll show you the screening tools, and we're really going to look at the screening tools and tools that agencies are using. It's kind of a combination of tools or toolbox that allows you to do these things safely and appropriately without creating an onerous compliance obligation on either people coming to see you or equally your staff as well too. I do take your point, George, as well too, that with it, you want to make sure that, especially for some community service organizations and religious groups being one of those, that the reason that people are going in, let's say, on specific days to either congregations or mass or the likes, or even volunteer groups and pastoral team leaders during the week, we don't want to take away from the reason that they're actually going in to these religious organizations in the first place. So with it, the idea is that you're screening people to ensure that you're keeping your, what I'll call, workplace site safe from COVID, and how you do that. We'll be having a look at the tools around this. Equally, if community service orgs or organizations are actually going and visiting clients as well too, then again, they may well be going into residential homes that you need to look at, well, what is the risk to your staff if people are not vaccinated or the likes, and that may include family members as well. We did cover off last week about brokerage or contractors that you might engage to go in. Certainly this may cover places like residential aged care services, NDIS funded agencies like disability agencies or the likes, where you may actually engage with a contractor to go in or brokerage with another agency. So when we look at these types of arrangements, what we are seeing is the requirements to actually look at the different legal pathways for different gatherings that you may have. And there are specific rules that we've covered off in terms of what you need to look at for small gatherings as well too, and a half a dozen odd dot points of what you should still be maintaining as part of your general work health and safety obligations. And this does relate back to our legal pathways that we have covered off in the past. Now, with it, as we move through the sessions, what we have seen and what has worked very, very well for a number of agencies is to use a number of screening tools that they've implemented across their agency. And we thank Rumbalara Aboriginal Cooperative and Women's Housing for allowing us to share some of their resources that they've done and that they've used as well too, and also Creation Ministries International for things like the attendance register, which I will show you as well too. And so with it, going on to the specific dashboards of what you need to look at, there are a number of tools that agencies are using. And let me just step you through these. Essentially, you've got the check-in codes that you utilize, you've got the vaccination registers that we've spoken about to staff, and you've also got your policies and procedures that your agency needs to look at. So what we have done as part of the resources for your agency, and you will get access to all of these resources today, is essentially the specific tools that allow you to manage your compliance obligations for your agencies. And this is tools that really allows you to manage your specific requirements and allows you to very quickly meet and measure exactly where your risks are, and also look at specifically where your specific areas are that you need to follow. Now, when we open this up, and I'll just bring you to this dashboard, and this is the dashboard that agencies like Rumballara and Women's Housing have essentially used. And let me walk you through this step by step, and you will get your login details today to be able to access these resources. So when we log in, essentially you can use your username and password that we'll send across to you. Essentially, you'll see a number of resources that your agencies can utilize. Now, essentially, as we go into the dashboard, there's a number of parts here that we can see. The first part is around your vaccination registers for your agency staff. As we mentioned, from a legal compliance viewpoint, it's important that you manage not only your vaccination registers for your personnel, being any employees, your contractors, your volunteers, but also your board members as well too, who may provide support services. And how you can actually do this is by, when we go into the HR section, if you click on that button here, this will bring up your register that you can see. And we've actually loaded in, for example, a person by the name of Jane Citizen, and I'll bring this up for you. So when we click on Jane Citizen, what we can see is we can go into the tabs, and then we can actually see the dates, and we've just issued this on the 2nd of the 11th, and the expiry is the 2nd of the 11th, 2022. And what this does is actually send Jane a reminder to say 3 months before it's due is, look, you've got your booster that's required to be filled. You can then run your reports directly on this as well too, and run your reports of exactly where you're at with all of your personnel at any point in time. It also means that you can then also load in this case, Jane's vaccination certificate. And if I bring that up here for you to view, then I click on the link here, and what essentially opens up is Jane's vaccination certificate. So I can actually keep a record as the community service agency or employer of Jane's status as a personnel, and also view this as we need to. It also then means that the reminders will also be sent out, and I've got those on record. Now, if there are specific items that I need to add in, let's say Jane has expressed concern on specific issues around the booster shots or the likes, I can then add in notes about any communication that we've had around, let's say, the booster shots of what's here. So essentially, there are file notes that you can then keep on here and any discussions that have occurred. And it makes it very simple for us to run our reports, and you've got your vaccination registers. So from a legal compliance point of view, a lot of the public health orders are asking agencies, employers, to record, document the vaccination information of their personnel, and things like this is important for your agency to utilize. The other part around this, when we go back, was around the check-in tools for clients that are coming in. And when we go back to our slides, and we can see these on the slides that I brought up, and you can do it with me if you like, we have these QR codes that we've actually set up. And if I use my phone, essentially what we've got is the registers for clients that are coming in to actually receive some sort of service from my agency. We can either have the attendance registers for those that don't have phones, or we have the QR codes. Now, these QR codes are slightly different to the government QR codes. The purpose of this is to actually screen clients as they're coming in to receive services for your agency. Once they open up the QR codes itself, what they will be asked is a series of questions. And the series of questions, quite simply, is for their name, their phone number, and also whether they have had any of the COVID symptoms. Now, the reason that we're actually continue to ask these questions is that even if you've had the vaccine, you could potentially still be a carrier of COVID itself. It also means that if people are coming in that are unvaccinated or exempt as well too, you want to ensure that essentially you're able to identify whether people have any of the COVID symptoms. So at the moment, agencies are actually screening clients to actually see if they have any of the COVID symptoms and also if anybody else is attending with them. Now, all they need to do is essentially complete those screens. You can see that we've actually just had a couple of people add in information here. And once they complete that, what it does do is then automatically register against your COVID contact tracing forms. And you can see that in here. And once we go into here, essentially we can see the information that we've got placed in here as well too. And again, we've got this information that we can actually go back. Agencies like Women's Housing and Rumballara have actually used this for their staff as well too. And essentially all staff are asked to do exactly the same thing, but they've got their COVID daily assessment form that they complete. And essentially this is really around ensuring that they meet all their requirements. And again, they've just got a slightly more detailed set of questions. And this follows the Department of Health and Human Services daily attestation forms. And essentially what we're doing here is just tracking to make sure that they don't have any of their COVID symptoms. It literally takes 30 seconds to do. And once they do that, they click on submit. If they do mark that they've got one or more of the symptoms, then their manager automatically gets notified out of the system. So essentially what you've got here is the capacity to actually look at the specific assessment forms for your agency. Now, with it, one of the other parts of this that agencies have asked us for is for the template policies for use. Now, there are a lot of templates that we've covered off over the past few weeks. And what we have done here, and you can see these in the Gemba Docs module, and you all have access to these, where you can actually log in. And we've got under the policies and procedures section a whole range of COVID policies. And this is around as we move from the pandemic to the endemic part of the phase of the COVIDSafe process, is to look at a range of policies. And these include work health and safety policies. We've got policies on social gatherings and travel restrictions and the likes. And again, you can simply click on these and these will open up for your agency to actually utilize and view. And essentially from today, you can start to use these template policies. We have updated these again. And for example, as I mentioned, this is around the social gatherings from today's session. And they are designed to be in Word format that your agency can also use as well too. We have just got a question coming up raised again. Thank you, Heidi. Who's just asked, is it okay to only require unvaccinated contractors to complete the attendance register attestation forms, or do all employees or contractors need to complete this? It's a good question, Heidi. Generally, we've found that agencies have asked their staff just to do it as part of their business as usual process. The reason being, you can, up to yourselves, actually ask people that are unvaccinated to actually complete it. Some agencies have certainly moved to that phase. However, we have found that agencies have generally got all staff to complete it, only because some people could still be a carrier of COVID-19 even if they are vaccinated itself. And it's generally seen as a process, as a business as usual process. So that's why they've simply done it as part of that initial assessment that they've done. Agencies like, for example, Rumballara and Women's Housing will do it before people actually see clients. And we've seen it as a process that, because they have people that work on a part-time or roster type of basis, and that's the reason that they've chosen to do it in that way. So essentially, you do have the Gemba Docs part of the works, that you do have your policies that you can continue to use as part of that process. So with it, as I've mentioned, as the roadmaps continue to reopen and you look at the specific requirements that you need to meet, there are still the obligations from Safe Work, picking up George's comments, that you will still need to meet your physical distancing rules, irrespective of whether you are a community service religious organisation. There are specific health and hygiene checklists that you also need to consider. There will be cleaning requirements that we will be covering off next week as well too, from purely a work health and safety point of view, and also attendance registers that you should be considering. With that, those are the specific recommendations that we are making for today. It is quite simple in terms of meeting your legal compliance obligations, in terms of looking at your screening register for clients, your staff vaccination registers, having a look at your client assessment policies as well. We will be looking at risk assessments and work health and safety obligations next week as part of our webinar, and that will allow you to manage all of your risks moving forwards as well. We will continue to open up and update the GEMBA 360 legal compliance dashboard for all agencies that are joining us today as well too. If you do have any questions, by all means ask it in the chat group now. We will stay online to answer all questions before we finish up. If you are watching this webinar after today's live session, then by all means please reach out to us on 1300 360 360, or you can email us at support@gemba360.com. Thank you for joining us today, everyone. Stay safe, and we will finish off the recording for the live session now and open up the phone lines for all attendees to ask any questions you have.